In rural Michigan, a search for a missing man ends in cold-blooded murder. Investigators call on a team of forensic scientists to establish the victim's time of death and bring his killer to justice. In Salinas, California, a couple finds a skeleton in a shallow grave under their house. A missing persons report, filed 14 years earlier, may have covered up a murder. Bones of lost victims may lie hidden for years. Time and the elements can destroy evidence. When those remains are finally discovered, the deceased have a chance to speak, and the tales they tell reveal grave secrets. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The quiet agricultural town of Salinas, California, is known for its abundant produce. A town of hard-working people, it hardly seems the place for a murder. But on January 14th, 1998, the owners of a house discovered something that would change that impression forever. Jim Olson told his wife Sandra and her sister that he discovered something strange in the crawl space under the house while installing heating ducts.
I just happened to look over and there's like a pair of shoes.
He found a pair of tennis shoes sticking out of the dirt, with the toes pointing upwards.
I'm not joking.
I want to see it.
Sure.
That's creepy.
He was too large to reach them in the cramped space. To Jim, it looked as if someone may have been buried in a shallow grave.
I just got out of there. I didn't want to see.
I want to see what's that.
I'm not going back down there.
They all hoped it was a prank.
They're directly back there, right under the kitchen.
We can't just leave them down there. It's creepy.
Yeah, we can.
You know what? I'll go.
But Sandra volunteered to check, just to make sure.
I'll go. Yeah. Okay. Be careful. Slide over here.
Yeah, straight back. See it?
Something was holding the shoes firmly in place.
It's stuck on something.
In the dim light, Sandra could see that the shoes were attached to a skeleton. Jim called 911. Officers from the Salinas Police Department responded to the call. Sergeant Miller and Detective McLaughlin were among the responding officers. Police confirmed that the bones were human, and the area was declared a crime scene.
All right, Dr. Galloway, as you can see, this is exactly how we found it. We got
To
the
properly
shoes up on
preserve the
stand.
site and recover the skeletal remains, investigators called in Dr. Allison Galloway, a forensic anthropologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz campus. Remarkably, Galloway found the skeleton to be complete and undisturbed by animals. The initial examination determined that the bones were likely male and that they had been there for a number of years.
We could tell that the body had been there for quite a while. There was no odor, there was no grease in the bone, there was no soft tissue left. So we say usually that takes about 5 years minimum, but it then can go anywhere up to 50 years. So we have quite a long range. We did see a lot of exfoliation of the bone. The bone itself wasn't disintegrating, but it was in a very protected environment.
Decomposed jeans and underwear suggested the victim had been fully clothed at the time of his death and burial. As Galloway carefully sifted through the remains, she found a .38 caliber bullet. Police now believed they had uncovered a homicide. As they scoured the area around the body, they uncovered some personal items, including a set of keys and a cigarette lighter. Sergeant Miller of the Salinas Police Department spoke with the family that currently owned the house.
Just a couple of real quick questions. Just pretty much the basics as far as when did you buy the house here?
They said that they had lived there for 2.5 years.
And I got the story just real quick. Let me just run it by and see if I got everything straight.
This was the first time anyone had been in the crawl space.
Push it over.
Now, investigators had to determine who this victim was. Without the victim's identity, police would not be able to track his
I
killer.
was surprised at how specific they are. I mean, this one's in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
The remains were sent to the UC Santa Cruz Anthropology Lab. There, they believed Dr. Galloway could provide vital information.
I'll get the bone board so we can do stature.
Okay. I'm going to go with the right femur.
Measurements confirmed that the remains were that of an adolescent male of European descent.
Okay,
He was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall.
To 5'10".
Okay.
Okay.
The bullet found among the remains indicated the victim had been shot.
The gladiolus and the xiphoid. On the sternal bodies.
To verify the cause of death, Dr. Galloway looked for any peculiarities on the bones.
Let's take a look at the skull here.
She discovered 2 gunshot holes in the victim's skull.
So, it looks like we have 2 entry wounds over here. This victim, we had a whole series of injuries. We had 2 gunshot injuries to the head, and at least 1 and possibly 2 gunshot injuries to the rest of the body. The first of the head ones came in on the right side, sort of around the ear, and probably exited through the left eye. And then the second injury came in a little bit further forward, and that moved and came out on this side over here.
There was also evidence of at least 1 entry wound to the victim's back.
And rib 7, we also have some breaking. Perimortem, this is around death.
Dr. Galloway reported her findings to Sergeant Miller.
Okay, doctor. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
He cross-referenced the address where the victim was found with missing persons reports dating back from 5 years earlier. He came up with a promising match. A teenage boy named Chris DeNoyer was reported missing from the same residence in 1984. Sergeant Miller reviewed the report. There was a picture on file, and Dr. Galloway's assessment was consistent with the missing boy's description.
Chris DeNoyer was last seen January 13th, 1984, and it was his mother who had notified police that, in fact, her son was missing at that time.
Investigators obtained Chris's dental records. Dr. Kevin Landon performed the analysis. He compared the x-rays from Chris's file to slides of the victim's dental remains. He noticed something.
I found that there was a retainer, an orthodontic type retainer on the lower jaw extending from his left canine tooth to his right canine tooth with an orthodontic band around it. During the time that this individual was alive, that was a standard type of orthodontic retainer to place. Nowadays they are made a little different, bonded in the back of the teeth so that they're not so visible.
Dr. Landon had found a positive match.
I concluded that the dental remains from this individual under the house matched the dental records that I received.
Investigators finally had a name and a face for their victim. Now they needed to find out who had murdered Chris Denoyer. But after 14 years, the killer's trail was cold. Little evidence remained. Police were uncertain they would ever solve this case.
Yeah.
Police in Salinas, California struggled to track the killer of Chris Denoyer, whose body was found 14 years after he was reported missing. A .38 caliber bullet was the only evidence the killer left behind. Investigators now needed to reconstruct the events that led up to his death. First, they wanted to make sure there was no access to the crawl space from the outside of the house. They found none.
There's only one way in and one way out. So the two possible scenarios are either it's a stranger or it's somebody that lives in the residence. Now, if you try to play out the stranger scenario, you'd have to say the stranger came into the house, murdered Chris, and then hoped that they would have enough time to drag this body into their house, dig a grave, cover it over, and crawl out before anyone comes home.
And that didn't seem likely to the police.
In my mind, the people that were suspects in this case were anyone that had access and control to the residence in January of 1984.
And the only access was from inside.
I'm not sure.
But Sergeant Miller wanted to be certain that Chris hadn't been murdered after he went missing. He made another call to Dr. Kevin Landon.
One of the questions that Detective Andy Miller of the Salinas Police Department asked of me was that would it have been possible for Christopher to have actually run away, returned a few years later, possibly been murdered by someone and placed under the house? And I could tell him that that was impossible due to the fact that his wisdom teeth had not developed any further.
It was proof that Chris was murdered just before the missing persons report was filed.
Thank you very much.
The police report indicated that Chris had a girlfriend at the time of his disappearance. They hoped she could give some insight into the family.
So she was the first person that we decided to contact, primarily because since she didn't live in the house, she wasn't as likely in our eyes to be a suspect.
She was dismayed to hear the news of Chris's death. She stated she first met Chris Denoyer in 1983. They dated up until his disappearance in '84. Chris, she said, was her first love. When asked about Chris's relationship with his parents, she said that Chris and his stepfather, Jackson Villarta, constantly fought. Villarta was always on him about something. She said she never believed Chris ran away. He wouldn't have left without saying goodbye to her.
Hi, Mrs. Villarta. Detective Miller from Salinas PD. We talked on the phone. Thank you.
Investigators decided it was time to speak with Chris's mother.
This is about your son, Christopher Denoyer.
Have you found him?
They tracked her down at her current residence.
And I'm
she was shocked by the news that Chris's body had been found. On the day Chris disappeared, she was at work. Her husband, Jackson Villarta, called her and told her that Chris had run away. She had been convinced he was still alive. In fact, they had received a telegram from him a few days after he disappeared. Chris, she said, was an average teenager, but they had their problems with him. He and his sister were having trouble adjusting to life with her new husband, Jackson Villarta. Investigators asked if anyone in the family owned a gun. She said that Jackson Villarta had one for home security, but she didn't know the kind. Miller didn't believe that Chris's mother had anything to do with the murder.
At the time of this murder, Chris's mother was pregnant, and she's a heavy-set woman to begin with, so the idea of her going through this very small crawl space and digging, a 6-foot trench under her house and dragging a 180-pound victim under there, that's pretty much out of the question.
But they did have a suspect in mind. Chris's stepfather, Jackson Villarta.
Specific there, and you can see from the crime scene sketch here that this body. We felt that the only person that could possibly benefit from burying a body underneath a residence was the person who was in control of that residence, and in this case, that's Jackson Villarta.
Villarta worked for the telephone company. They found him on his route.
Excuse me, Mr. Villarta. How are you, sir?
As investigators approached, they noticed he had the right size and build to dig the 6-foot trench in the crawl space.
We're from Salinas PD.
Mr. Villarta, I already talked to your supervisor.
He agreed to accompany them in for questioning. He was cooperative and admitted that he and Chris had had their troubles. But he said that was normal. Teenagers often have conflicts with their step-parents.
One other thing I'd like to explain to you. A lot of times when people come down to the police department.
Villarta said he worked from noon to 8 p.m. on the day Chris disappeared. When he got home, his wife told him that Chris had run away.
This is Detective Miller.
His story contradicted what his wife had told investigators earlier.
Anything else?
A few days later, he said, they received a mailgram from Chris saying he was sorry for all the trouble he had caused and that he had moved out. Investigators were suspicious. Villarta admitted that he had 2 guns, a .22 caliber rifle and a .38 caliber revolver. The caliber of the handgun interested Sergeant Miller.
The rounds we'd found in the grave, that Chris had been murdered with a .38 caliber weapon. So it was a very significant piece of information.
The police needed to get a search warrant to examine the revolver. They went to Villarta's house to prevent him from entering and removing the handgun. With a warrant in hand, police searched the home where Villarta now lived. They collected the .38 caliber revolver and some ammunition. While they waited for the ballistics testing to be completed, they checked out Villarta's story. They secured all of his personal records for January of 1984.
So we've got to look at this. We've got a call.
There was one small detail that piqued their interest.
We've got a call at 1. Look at this. Hey, Bob. Yeah. Come here and take a look at this.
The mailgram that was supposedly sent by Chris 3 days after he disappeared was ordered from and billed to Villarta's home phone.
So this is dynamite. Right. But we've got to find
Chris had already been murdered.
Was calling these numbers.
Police knew that Villarta had written it.
So there was definitely somebody home. The one sentence in the mailgram that completely gave it away that Jackson was the author was when the statement was that in some ways Jackson was right. And you're talking about a 16-year-old kid who hated his stepfather. Is he going to write in this letter that he thinks that his stepfather was right? The only person that would write that was Jackson. So the whole idea of the mailgram right from the beginning was preposterous. 84.
The circumstantial evidence against Jackson Villarta was mounting.
The house on Navajo Drive.
But investigators would need one more piece of evidence to make an arrest. Detectives in Salinas, California had identified Jackson Villarta as the prime suspect in the murder of his teenage stepson, Chris DeNoyer. But they still needed physical evidence to link him to the scene of the crime. A .38 caliber revolver and ammunition were collected during a search of his house. Scott Armstrong, senior criminalist with the California State Department of Justice, examined the gun. He fired the weapon into a water tank. And collected the spent bullets.
The gun, whether it's a revolver or a pistol, will have two kinds of markings that they impress on the bullet: class characteristics and individual characteristics. The class characteristics would be things that would be common to all guns of that make and manufacture.
The individual characteristics are unique markings called lands and grooves, which are left on a bullet as it travels through the gun barrel. They are as individual as fingerprints. Using a comparison microscope, he compared the bullets from the crime scene to the bullets fired from Villarta's weapon side by side. The bullets matched.
There were class markings and individual markings that were sufficient that I could identify the bullet as having been fired from the revolver.
It was the hard evidence investigators needed.
Mr. Villarta, with your left hand, slowly reach out and open the door from the outside. Slowly step out of the vehicle and face away from me. Take 2 steps to your left. Stop. Put your hands behind your back and interlace your fingers. Get down on your knees.
On February 6, 1999, Jackson Villarta was arrested for the murder of Chris DeNoyer 15 years earlier. Under questioning, he denied all charges and maintained his innocence. At trial, investigators presented a videotape that proved it wasn't likely an outsider broke into the home, killed Chris, and then buried him in the crawl space. An officer matching Villarta's physical description dug a hole in the confined area. The experiment was timed. It took a little over an hour.
So getting back to the fact that if an outsider had come into this place, done the murder, and decided this was how he was going to dispose of the body, he would have had to commit himself to a minimum of 1 hour in sort of the danger zone, because if someone had come home while he was there, they would have been discovered.
Based on the evidence, investigators believe Jackson Villarta and Chris argued that day.
You're going to give me that respect. Yes, you are.
You're not my father.
You're going to give me that respect. Like it or not.
In a rage, Villarta grabbed his .38 caliber gun and shot Chris twice in the head and once in the chest. Then, he hid his body in the crawl space under the house. On February 1st, 2000, Jackson Villarta was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 17 years to life. Jackson Villarta thought that burying his victim under the house would permanently conceal the evidence of his crime. But some killers believe time and the elements will erase the evidence for them. In June 1995, the Lansing Police Department in Michigan was working a difficult case. Detective Jay Trost led the investigation.
We got a missing person, has been missing quite some time. We're looking, I got a photo of here I'm gonna pass out, see if anyone here can locate this guy or if everyone else.
29-year-old Mark Bosom had vanished.
Anyone got any questions on him or anything like that?
Do you know if he's supposed to be armed with any type of...
Well, we believe he's more of a victim. We don't suspect he'd be armed, but you never know, so be careful. At this point, I wouldn't really consider it.
Mark's wife, Cindy, reported him missing 3 weeks earlier.
For him, if you find anything about him, anyone that knows him, any information you might think is pertinent, just give me a call or leave me a message and I'll get back with you. He's been missing for...
The longer Mark was missing, the more Detective Trost suspected foul play. He needed to find out if anyone had seen him or knew of his whereabouts. Officers were sent to interview his relatives, friends, and acquaintances. They learned that the day before Mark disappeared, he cashed his income tax check and was paid from his job. But dozens of interviews turned up nothing else. The police could find no one who'd heard from him since his disappearance.
He wasn't seen anywhere, couldn't find anyone that had any kind of contact. We couldn't even find anyone that had even seen him or could remember seeing him, anything like that. So he just like vanished.
Sergeant Mark Murray was eager to speak with Mark Bosom's wife, Cindy, the last person known to have seen him. She admitted to him that she and her husband had their problems and were separated as a result, but claimed that both of them wanted to save the marriage.
She appeared to me to be a very loving and caring mother. She and Mark had had a daughter, and she seemed to be trying to keep the family together. So they were trying to iron out their differences and get things worked out and patched up.
She told the sergeant that a few nights before his disappearance, Mark visited her at the bowling alley where she worked as a waitress. When he arrived, a man named Tom Hart was talking to her. Mark was uncomfortable with Hart and believed that he was interested in more than just a friendship with his wife. According to Cindy, Hart was infatuated with her. She told Sergeant Murray that on several occasions she noticed Hart following her after work. In fact, her husband insisted that she take out a restraining order against him. But Cindy considered Hart a friend and couldn't believe that he had anything to do with Mark's disappearance. Sergeant Murray wasn't so sure.
Hey guys, how's it going?
What I thought was that led a little more credibility to the fact that some foul play could have been involved in his gone missing as opposed to him just leaving on his own.
Investigators decided to take a closer look at Tom Hart. When questioned by investigators, Hart was cooperative. The 52-year-old claimed that he and Cindy Bosom had more than a friendly relationship. He said that Cindy was planning on divorcing her estranged husband and moving in with him, but was apprehensive about telling Mark. Hart admitted that the last time he saw Mark was the night before he disappeared. He had met with him in person to inform him of their intentions. While Mark wasn't happy about this news, the conversation ended cordially. In fact, he had asked Hart for a ride to a nearby convenience store. Hart agreed and dropped him off. As Mark walked toward the store, he approached two men who were standing outside. He seemed to know them. When Hart asked if he wanted a ride back, Mark declined, saying he'd get one later. That was the last time he saw him. Police asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph test. Though he insisted he had nothing to hide, Hart refused, claiming he had no idea where Mark Bosom was. Investigators didn't believe him.
By his tone and his mannerisms and his basically, it's not that he wouldn't answer questions, but he was very evasive in his answers. He wasn't real forthcoming with a lot of information. We had to pry everything out of him. He would give you an answer to a question, but he never gave you any meat.
Investigators knew Hart was covering up for something. And there was still no evidence of a crime. Police in Lansing, Michigan worked to solve the missing persons case of 29-year-old Mark Bosom. Tom Hart, the last person to see him the night he disappeared, said he dropped Mark off at a convenience store. Investigators doubted his story. They contacted the manager of the convenience store to see if there was a surveillance camera in the parking lot. There wasn't one. And no one remembered seeing either man that night. With no evidence of a crime and only their suspicions that Tom Hart was involved in Mark's disappearance, investigators met to discuss their next move. The investigation was going nowhere. But then they caught a break.
At that point, there was some information that Tom Hart owned a farm. Well, from the time that Mark Bosom came up missing to like within a week and a half, Tom Hart decided to till up his land.
If Hart was involved in Mark Bosom's disappearance, it was also likely he would hide the evidence.
He could have taken him out to the farm and disposed of the body and tilled him up in the soil.
With the assistance of the Michigan State Police, Sergeant Murray conducted an air reconnaissance of Tom Hart's farm.
We were looking for where the ground had been tilled up and disturbed. Maybe a grave had been dug, that the furrows would be different in the ground.
It was a promising lead. But after hours of searching, there was no evidence of a burial or a recent grave. Without a search warrant, all investigators could do was wait.
After approximately a month, there was nothing. And on a missing case like this, it starts to go cold. There wasn't a whole lot more that could be done. What we needed to do is either find him alive or dead and then go from there. We were unable to find anything.
The investigation had hit a dead end. Trost had been down this road before and knew that someday a clue would turn up. He just had to be patient. Almost a year and a half later, in nearby Shiawassee County, a man walking his dog made a terrible discovery. hidden among some brush, lay a human skull. He called the police. Detective Trost and crime scene technicians from the Lansing Police Department responded.
Hey, what we got going?
Investigators hoped this was the lead they had been waiting for. Until now, they had a suspect, but no hard evidence of a crime. They collected the decomposed skull, then carefully searched the area.
How long ago would you say you got here? How long has it been?
Nearby, they recovered articles of clothing, a blood-stained blanket, and more human remains. They also found a spent .22 caliber bullet casing. From the level of decomposition, vines that had grown through the tattered clothing, and some insect larvae, they determined that the body had been there for some time. But their search of the area yielded no clues to the victim's identity. Investigators forwarded the skeletal remains to Michigan State University for analysis. There, forensic anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer looked to the bones to help establish the person's identity.
Border of the eye orbit right along here.
After analyzing the shape and dimension of brow ridges on the skull, Dr. Sauer concluded that the victim was male, likely in his late 20s to early 30s. From the measurements of the femur, he determined the individual stood between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 9 inches tall. He also discovered marks on one of the vertebrae, evidence that this victim had been shot in the chest.
Our conclusion was that this was probably a homicide.
David, 314 to Central.
But detectives couldn't be certain that this victim was the long-missing Mark Bosom. The physical description roughly matched Bosom's, but it also matched countless other missing persons. To catch the killer and determine who the victim was, investigators would have to find a way to pinpoint exactly when this victim died.
Not too bad. Just getting some dental records. Oh, it is frustrating, very frustrating. At this point, there's no way for us to say for sure who this person is.
The victim's clothing and the blanket recovered from the crime scene were sent to forensic entomologist Dr. Richard Merritt. As an expert in insect growth and development, Dr. Merritt analyzes the life cycles of bugs found on a corpse and estimates how much time has elapsed since a person's death.
The time of death can be determined using the life cycle of an insect. So basically when someone dies, the insects are attracted immediately to the body within hours.
Dr. Merritt began by identifying each of the species found on the shirt and blanket. Among the various insects present, Dr. Merritt observed an adult parasitic wasp. Though other insects are attracted to a corpse within 24 hours of death, research has shown that wasps will not appear and lay their eggs for several months. Then it takes time for the wasp larvae to hatch and mature into adults. Adding in the wasp's maturation process, Dr. Merritt narrowed down this victim's time of death.
The entomological findings showed that this body had been around from 4 to 8 months, maybe longer, since the person died.
Dr. Merritt's findings held promise. This victim hadn't been killed recently. Forensic botanist Dr. Frank Ewers analyzed the grapevines found growing through the victim's clothing. By examining the internal structure of the wood stems, Dr. Ewers was able to calculate the age of the vine.
Here you can see a growth ring. From this, we can tell that there was quite a lot of growth the previous year. So that meant that it had to be at least 15 months old. And so it told us that the body had to be there at least 15 months.
I haven't got any new information from anybody.
It was the break investigators were waiting for. Cindy Bosom put them in touch with Mark's dentist.
Statements here, what the people had said at the party store.
His dental records were sent to anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer. Dr. Sauer compared Mark's dental x-rays with the post-mortem x-rays taken from the victim's remains.
Once the police had an idea who the remains belonged to, they went to that person's dentist and were able to get a hold of dental records and dental x-rays. And that allowed us to do a side-by-side comparison and positively identify the remains as those of Mark Allen Bosom.
With the help of forensic examiners, police had finally identified the victim. Now they needed to tie Tom Hart to the crime. Looking for answers, they began questioning all known associates of the suspect.
And then let me know what happens.
Will do.
An acquaintance of Hart's told police that Hart owned a .22 caliber gun. In fact, he and Hart had used such a gun for target practice prior to Mark Bosom's disappearance.
Man, you show me how it's done.
Okay, I will. Now, just watch the old timer. I'll show you how it's done. Okay, great. See you.
The information was enough to get a warrant to search Hart's property. Investigators paid particular attention to Tom Hart's gun collection. They recovered a Winchester Model 94 and a Remington 16-gauge shotgun. Detective Jay Trost knew that neither gun was of the caliber used in the homicide.
I was looking for a .22 handgun, something like that. I did collect some rifles. I didn't really, in my heart, believe that they were involved, but you got to collect everything, and sometimes stories change. So we took what we could find, but there wasn't much there.
18 months after Mark Bosom's murder, investigators had a suspect, but still no evidence against him. In Lansing, Michigan, police were investigating the murder of Mark Bosom. Their suspect, Thomas Hart, was obsessed with Mark's estranged wife. Police had a motive, but no evidence. A search of his property turned up nothing. Investigators learned that the vehicle Hart drove at the time of Mark Bosom's disappearance was parked outside his work. They impounded it for a closer inspection.
Tom, Detective Murray, you remember me? Here's a search warrant. We're taking your vehicle in for processing.
Although the car had been thoroughly cleaned, they detected trace amounts of blood.
When we went through it, we were able to determine with luminol that there was actually blood on the passenger seat.
And that wasn't all. When they cut the seat open, they discovered that the cushion below was covered with dried blood.
It had been there a year and a half, and it was degraded. I mean, it smelled like degraded blood. When you looked down, I went, whoa. I was expecting little trace amounts of blood. There was like a big puddle of dried blood. So with that was very, very good and exciting evidence for me, because now with this blood, we got somewhere to go. We can figure out whose blood it is. I am assuming at this time that it's probably Mark Bosom's blood. Now I got to figure out how to get that analyzed.
Investigators knew that if both parents were alive, a DNA match could be established.
I knew that the mother was alive. I called her, and she was able to tell me that the father wasn't back alive. So we actually drew blood from both those people. It was turned over to the crime lab along with the evidence they had at the scene, and they were able to analyze that and hopefully get DNA.
They were in luck. It was a match.
The blood in the car matches both parents' blood, which in turn is Mark Bosom blood. So now we got an exact match. And in my mind right now, we got enough probably to get an arrest warrant for murder.
Police finally had the evidence they needed to arrest Tom Hart. But Hart was hiding out at his farm. Because of his violent history, they didn't want to rush the house. And it was only a matter of time before he came out. Police watched and waited.
He was pretty much aware that there was a warrant out for him by now, and he was hiding out. He actually walked out, got in the vehicle, and left, and he didn't even go out on the road. I'm guessing if he didn't go out on the road, maybe he thought the police weren't going to get him. But he drove through the field. When they saw that, they just swooped in on him.
Keep your hands where we can see them. Put your hands on top of your head. Turn and face the female officer. Now walk backwards towards me. Walk backwards towards me. That's it. Keep walking. Keep walking. Get to the corner of the car and stop.
He was arrested for the first-degree murder of Mark Bosom.
Tom, we have a warrant for your arrest.
Hey, have a seat, please.
At the police department, Tom Hart was informed of his rights.
Do you understand you've been arrested for first-degree murder? Before we get into that, I'll talk to you about that.
He refused to answer any questions and demanded his attorney.
We'll get you your attorney. We're ready. We can get someone to come in here. Ready, you can take him down to the jail. Right up there against the window.
He was placed in the Lansing County Jail to await trial.
Take him downtown.
When it became clear that Cindy Bosom only wanted to be friends, a jealous Hart confronted Mark Bosom. He lured him into his car. Then he drove Mark Bosom to a deserted area where he shot the unsuspecting victim in the neck. Hart disposed of the body, believing that no one would find it. On January 9th, 1998, Thomas Hart was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Some killers believe they can get away with murder. Hiding a body may seem like the best plan, but even when many years have passed and only bones remain, forensic science can find the truth and uncover grave secrets.